The estate attorney looked up from the document, found my eyes across the mahogany table, and then looked away. That half-second told me everything I needed to know. My grandfather-in-law had changed his will 11 days before he died. My name, written into that document 14 months earlier at his specific and deliberate request, was gone. The estate was worth $1.2 million. I had a folder in my bag that no one in that room knew existed. What happened over the next 2 hours meant that by nightfall, 3 members of my fiancé's family were facing a formal fraud investigation in the state of South Carolina. My name is Ray. I'm 29 years old. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbia, the daughter of a school bus driver and a woman who worked the front desk at a physical therapy clinic for 22 years without once asking for a raise because she was afraid of making things uncomfortable. I watched my mother make herself small her whole life, folding herself down at the table, speaking a little softer whenever the room seemed like it might push back. I loved her for it, and I was terrified by it in equal measure. I promised myself I would not do the same. I put myself through the University of South Carolina on loans and a county scholarship. I graduated with honors in accounting, passed all 4 parts of the CPA exam on my first attempt, and spent the next 5 years building a reputation as a senior financial analyst at one of the larger regional accounting firms in Charleston. I was good at finding things that weren't supposed to be found. Gaps in balance sheets, transfers that didn't quite line up with the story above them, numbers that whispered the truth even when the document told something else. It was, in the end, exactly that skill that saved me. I met my fiancé through a mutual friend at a dinner party 3 years ago. He was charming in the particular way that men from old Charleston money tend to be charming. Effortlessly warm, self-deprecating, just enough to make you forget that the family portrait in his parents' sitting room had been painted in oil in 1987. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. The ring had been his grandmother's. I said yes. His family was another matter entirely. His mother made it clear, from the first Thanksgiving, that she had a very specific picture of the woman her son was supposed to marry, and I did not fit it. I didn't summer anywhere. I hadn't gone to the right school. She once described my accent, within earshot and to another guest, as refreshingly unpolished, and then smiled at me like she'd paid me a compliment. She never said anything directly cruel enough to confront. It was always sideways. A long pause before answering when someone asked how my fiancé and I met. A comment about how impressive it was that I handled my own finances. The kind of hostility that leaves no mark you can point to but accumulates like water damage behind a wall. Silent and structural and deeply intentional. My father-in-law followed her lead in all things and pretended otherwise. My future sister-in-law treated me like a house guest who had overstayed her welcome at a party she hadn't been invited to in the first place. The only one who was simply genuinely kind to me was my fiancé's grandfather. He was 81 years old. He had built a small commercial real estate company from nothing after coming back from Vietnam, took out a loan on a piece of land outside Goose Creek, and spent the next 30 years making something out of it. He sold the business in his early 60s for more than anyone expected. After his wife passed 6 years before I met him, he spent his days reading history books, growing tomatoes in the backyard of his house in Mount Pleasant, and saying exactly what he thought to everyone around him with the easy confidence of a man who had outlived most of his critics. He wore the same brown cardigan to every family dinner regardless of the occasion. He shook my hand the first time we met and said, "I heard you're an accountant, good. Lord knows this family could use one." We talked at every gathering after that. He asked real questions and remembered the answers. When my firm handled a complicated nonprofit audit that made the local business section, he called my fiancé specifically to pass along his congratulations to me. He was the only person in that family who seemed to understand that I had built something real and that it was worth acknowledging. 14 months before he died, he called me on a Saturday morning and asked if I could come by the house alone. No particular reason given, just, "Come by if you have time." I went that afternoon. He made coffee, strong, in a percolator he'd had since the 90s, and sat me down at his kitchen table. He pushed a manila folder across to me without saying anything first and let me open it myself. It was a copy of his estate documents, his will, his revocable trust, a schedule of assets. He walked me through each section methodically, the way a person does when they want to make sure you actually understand, not just nod along. Near the end, he pointed to a specific paragraph and tapped it once with his finger. "That's new," he said. I had my attorney, not the family's attorney, my own, draw it up about 2 weeks ago. I want you to keep a copy somewhere safe. Not here, not at his place, somewhere that's yours. The clause was clear. $400,000 from his liquid assets, directed to my fiancé and to me jointly by full legal name upon our marriage, in recognition of integrity, of care, and of the kind of loyalty that does not require an audience. He watched me read it over his coffee cup. I looked up when I finished. I know what they say about you when you're not in the room, he said. I want you to know I don't agree with it. I want you to know that it's written down. I didn't cry, I thanked him. I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat and spent that evening scanning every page and printing 2 copies. I kept the originals in a fireproof lockbox in my bedroom closet and didn't tell my fiancé. His grandfather had asked me not to. He said he didn't want it to become something that got negotiated over. He went into hospice care 8 months later, congestive heart failure, a slow progression his doctors had been tracking for years. I visited twice a week when I could, sometimes more. The last 2 months were hard. He was on heavy doses of pain medication by the end. Some visits he knew me and some he didn't. I came anyway. He passed on a Tuesday morning in March. The formal reading of the will was scheduled 3 weeks later at the family's estate attorney's office downtown. A Friday afternoon, my fiancé and I drove there together. He was quiet the whole way. I thought it was grief. I understand now it was something else. The attorney was a woman in her mid-50s with a careful manner, every sentence slightly cushioned, every potential difficulty preemptively smoothed. The family was gathered around the conference table when we arrived. My mother-in-law sat at the far end, with her hands folded and her posture perfect. My father-in-law was to her right. My future sister-in-law had her phone out until the moment the reading began. My fiancé sat beside me and didn't reach for my hand. The attorney read through the document in sections, a bequest to a veterans organization he'd supported for decades. Personal items distributed among the grandchildren, the house in Mount Pleasant to be sold, proceeds folded back into the trust, and then she reached the clause about the liquid assets. She paused, a beat too long, and then she looked up and found my eyes and looked away, that quick, reflexive redirect of someone who doesn't want to be the one delivering a particular piece of news. The clause she read aloud did not include my name. The $400,000 was directed to my fiancé, alone, unconditionally, no joint beneficiary, no mention of me at all. The revision, she noted, had been executed 11 days before the date of death. I sat very still. My mother-in-law let out a small, almost inaudible breath. Not quite a sigh, not quite satisfaction, just the smallest possible release of something she'd been holding. My fiancé put his hand on mine. I turned to look at him. His face was not surprised. His face was the face of a man who has been privately rehearsing a moment and feels something close to relief that it has finally arrived. When the reading concluded, my mother-in-law stood and thanked the attorney and suggested everyone come back to the house. My future sister-in-law disappeared into the hallway. My father-in-law lingered by the attorney to discuss the property sale timeline. My fiancé steered me toward the window, at the far end of the hall, away from the others, with a hand at my elbow that was gentler than the situation warranted. He said he should have told me before today. I asked him what exactly he knew. He said his mother had called him 6 weeks ago with concerns. She felt that since we weren't yet married, it was premature to have my name formally listed on any inheritance clause. He'd spoken with the family's estate attorney. Not the independent one his grandfather had retained for the original document, but the family's own attorney, and they had arranged a revision. He said it was just logistics. He said he didn't think I would take it this way. I asked him if his grandfather had been consulted about the change before it was made. He said his grandfather had been pretty far gone by that point, and that the family felt it was kinder not to burden him with paperwork. Something settled in my chest then, cold and very clear. My future sister-in-law reappeared at my elbow holding a folded check. She pressed it into my hand without preamble. $5,000 made out to me. A gesture of goodwill from the family, she said. She hoped we could all move forward with grace. I looked at the check. I looked at her. I folded it in half and held it back out to her. She didn't take it right away. She stared at my hand like she wasn't sure what she was seeing. She had expected the check to end the conversation. She had expected me to fold. My mother-in-law joined us in the hall. She tilted her head and looked at me with the expression she reserved for difficult conversations. a studied mixture of sympathy and mild disappointment, as though she were the one being patient with me. She said she hoped I understood this wasn't personal. She said her father-in-law had been sentimental and confused in his final months and had made several decisions that didn't reflect the family's true wishes. She said I seemed like a smart girl, and smart girls knew when a situation wasn't theirs to fight. She said the money needed to stay in the family. My father-in-law stepped out of the conference room and folded his arms. He said, in a level and deliberate tone, that their family had 3 attorneys on retainer and a great deal of patience for litigation. He suggested I think carefully about whether the cost, in time, in money, in professional reputation, was worth it for someone in my position. Someone in my position. He said it exactly like that. My fiancé stood slightly behind his father and looked at the floor. I asked if I could use the restroom. The receptionist pointed me down the hall. I went in, ran cold water over my wrists, and looked at myself in the mirror for about 10 seconds. Not because I needed to compose myself, because I wanted to be sure. Then I took out my phone and made 2 calls. The first was to the hospice facility in Mount Pleasant. I asked to speak with the nurse who had been assigned to my grandfather-in-law, a woman I'd spoken with many times during those visits, who had once told me, unprompted, that she wished more families sent someone like me regularly. I asked her a specific question about his medical status during the 11 days before his death. She gave me a specific answer. I asked if she would put it in writing. She said she already had. She'd documented it in her personal notes 3 weeks ago because she'd had a feeling something like this might come up. The second call was to the Elder Financial Abuse Reporting Line maintained by the South Carolina Attorney General's office. I'd looked up that number the evening I pulled the original will from my lockbox and reread the asset schedule, because I'd noticed 5 wire transfers from his personal savings account, totaling $85,000, that had moved to an account in my mother-in-law's name between September and December of that year. I had pulled the documentation then. I had been waiting to see if this meeting today would make it necessary. It had. I walked back down the hall, picked up my bag, and returned to the conference room where the family was gathered. I set my folder on the mahogany table. I told them I'd like to share some documents before we all left. My mother-in-law said there was nothing left to discuss. I said I disagreed. The folder held 3 things: the certified copy of the original will, notarized 14 months prior by an independent notary, with the joint beneficiary clause fully intact. A printed record of 5 wire transfers from his personal savings account to an account in my mother-in-law's name, totaling $85,000, executed during the months before he entered hospice. And a signed statement from his hospice nurse, dated that morning, attesting that during the 11-day window in which the revised will had allegedly been executed, he had been receiving continuous palliative sedation and had not been consistently lucid or legally capable of executing documents. The family's attorney picked up the first page carefully. She read it, she set it down and picked up the bank records. Her face didn't change the way faces usually change, but something shifted behind her eyes, the particular look of a professional calculating exposure. My mother-in-law said the transfers were gifts, freely given. He had wanted her to have that money. I said that might be true, and noted that a financial investigator would have no difficulty determining whether it was. My father-in-law's voice went tight in a way I hadn't heard before. He said I was making accusations I didn't have the standing to make. He said their attorneys would handle this. He said I would regret starting something I couldn't finish. I said I hadn't started anything, and I told him that the Attorney General's Elder Abuse Reporting Line had received the full document packet 40 minutes before I walked into this building. The silence that followed was a different quality than the silences before it. My fiancé looked at me across the table. He had gone the color of old paper. "Ray," he said quietly, "you didn't." I looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had stood behind his father while his father threatened me, at the man who had let his mother arrange the erasure of my name from a document a dying old man had written specifically because he believed in me, at the man who had held my hand for 3 years and not said a single word in that room, not one, that wasn't designed to manage me. I took the ring off my finger. I set it on the table in front of him. Not dramatically, I just put it down, the way you set down something that doesn't belong to you anymore. Then I looked at the attorney. I told her I had no interest in any personal financial benefit from the estate. The $400,000 could go wherever the court directed it. What I wanted was for someone with the appropriate authority to examine the circumstances under which that revision had been executed, because a man I cared about had been very clear about his wishes when he still had the clarity to express them, and someone in this room had decided that his clarity didn't count. The attorney closed the folder. She looked at my mother-in-law. She said very precisely, "I think we need to speak privately before this proceeds any further." My mother-in-law's composure held for about 2 seconds before it didn't. Her face did something I had never seen it do. It gave way, briefly, before she caught it and rebuilt it. She pressed her lips together. She looked at me, and for the first time in 3 years, she looked at me like I was actually there. I picked up my bag, I buttoned my coat, I walked out. My father-in-law said as I reached the door that I was making the worst mistake of my life. That no one in Charleston would trust me after this, that I had no idea what I was setting in motion. I told him I didn't start this, I was just the one who finished it. I drove home with my phone face down on the passenger seat. I called my dad instead of reading the texts. He picked up on the second ring the way he always does. I talked for the whole 40-minute drive north. He listened. Near the end, he said quietly, "Baby, you did the right thing. That was all I needed." The investigation moved faster than I expected. Elder financial abuse cases tend to, when the documentation is as organized as what I had provided. The wire transfers were flagged by the state's Financial Crimes Unit as probable exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The revised will was contested on procedural grounds, given the hospice nurse's documented statement and the medical records confirming his sedation schedule during the relevant window. A court ultimately determined that the revision had been executed under circumstances that could not be verified as legally competent, and voided it. The original will was reinstated. I declined to accept the joint bequest. My attorney sent a letter directing that my portion be redistributed to the Veterans Organization listed elsewhere in the document. He would have wanted that, I knew that about him. My mother-in-law was required to repay the $85,000 to the estate. The DA ultimately declined criminal prosecution, citing the complexity of proving intent in elder financial cases where the transfers had been structured as gifts. But the family's estate attorney quietly withdrew from their other matters. And in Charleston, the kind of quiet that follows a public exposure like that one, where people remain perfectly polite to your face and stop returning calls, is a sentence all its own. My fiancé reached out once, about 3 months later, with a long email. It was mostly about how hard the experience had been for him. I read it twice, I didn't write back. What I kept is a pocket watch. His grandfather pressed it into my hand 6 weeks before he died, on a Tuesday afternoon when I came to sit with him. He said it had been his own father's, and that he wanted it to go to someone who would take care of things. He said it just like that, take care of things. And I understood he wasn't only talking about the watch. It sits on my dresser now, and I see it every morning when I get up for work. I won't tell you, it didn't hurt. It hurt the way it hurts when you realize that some part of the life you were building wasn't quite real, that certain walls were made of something that never would have held. Losing a future you planned around, even a flawed one, even a future that would have cost you more than you understood. That's a real loss, and I sat with it honestly. I'm not someone who needs to pretend a wound isn't a wound. But I also know what it felt like to sit at a kitchen table in Mount Pleasant with a man who looked across it and said, "I know what they say about you, and I want you to know I don't agree with it." That kind of trust is not a small thing. That kind of trust is the whole thing. And when the moment came, I chose to be worthy of it, not because there was money in it, and not because I wanted to win. Because he had written down that loyalty doesn't require an audience, and I had decided to live like I believed it. If someone in your life has ever handed you a check and called it grace, and expected you to fold it into your pocket and disappear, I want you to understand something. The people who try to buy your silence are always, without exception, the ones most afraid of what you'll say if you don't take the money. Your presence is not a complication, your voice is not a disruption, and the life you've built with your own hands is not something anyone gets to revise without your name on it. Drop a comment if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your integrity. I read everything. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who needs it. And subscribe. I'll be here.